Christs, and we'll be your hosts tonight. Whoever you are, whatever is going on in your life currently, we are so glad that you've been able to join us as we seek to rationally engage with some of life's biggest questions.
All the information you'll need will be in the description to this live stream and also in the live chat. And I'd particularly like to draw attention to two things. So firstly, Richard and Andrew have agreed to have a question time at the end of the conversation. Thank you, Richard and Andrew. And you can submit your questions via a Google form link in the description. And James and I will ask as many of them to Andrew and Richard as we can. And secondly, there is a link to a passage in the Bible, which Andrew is going to touch on. So do make use of the link so that you can follow where he's referencing from. And this event is scheduled to run for an hour, and we'll listen in on Richard and Andrew's discussion for the first section. And then at 8:10, we'll have a bit of time for questions. So again, do make use of the Google form below.
I guess the only thing left to do is to welcome our speakers. We're hugely grateful to have Reverend Dr. Andrew Sach and Professor Richard Buggs with us tonight. Andrew is a contemporary Christian speaker and author who regularly speaks about the intersections between science and Christianity. He holds a doctorate in auditory systems biology from York University and currently serves as a minister at a church in London.
Richard Buggs is currently Senior Research Leader of Plant Health at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew and Professor of Evolutionary Genomics at Queen Mary University, London. And he speaks regularly on both his research area of ash dieback and also the intersections between biology and Christianity. Most recently, he featured in a BBC article on Darwin's abominable mystery last weekend. So do make sure to have a look at that as well.
Interestingly, both Richard and Andrew went to Cambridge as undergraduate natural scientists. However, to a certain extent, they kind of went in opposite directions. Now, Amy and I are going to disappear now and hand over to Richard and Andrew, who are going to tell us a bit about how their views on Darwin changed over time. So Richard and Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, James and Amy, and hello, thanks for giving up your evening if you're tuning in and joining us today. I can't see who you are or how many people there are, but maybe there's some of you out there. And Richard and I are good friends now, but we didn't know each other back in Cambridge. And as James said, we did follow slightly opposite paths. So I went up to Cambridge as an atheist. I was reading lots of Richard Dawkins and quite convinced by it. I was very skeptical about faith. And in my first year at St. John's, I became a Christian. And now I'm an Anglican vicar. Whereas in Richard's case, well, I'll let him speak for himself. He made a slightly different trajectory.
So I went up to Cambridge as a Christian, but now I'm a Professor of Evolutionary Genomics. So we've kind of gone in opposite directions. You might have expected me to have become the vicar and Andrew to have become the evolutionary biologist. But here we are today, a Bible teacher and a geneticist.
And basically what that means is I'm going to say some things from the Bible and Richard's going to say some things about genetics, and hard questions about evolution will be Richard's, and well, hopefully not difficult questions about theology will be mine. But because I'm a vicar, I thought I'd start with the Bible, and we're going to get on to the question of Darwin and natural selection and what that means for the whole topic. But I wanted to start with an interesting passage from the Bible where one of Jesus' followers, the Apostle Paul, is in Athens, which was the first century intellectual capital. And we're told he got talking to some Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. And that's quite interesting for our current topic, because the Epicureans, they believed that the world was random and come about by chance, whereas the Stoics believed that there was evidence of design and some kind of divine mind behind it. And so the kind of debates that would have happened in Athens in the first century are a little bit similar to the kind of debates that we're having right now in this conversation. And I want to just begin by reading some of what Paul, Jesus' follower, said to introduce the Christian faith. He says this: "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and doesn't live in temples built by human hands. He's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else." And we'll come back to a bit later some more of his speech. But the Christian claim is that God is our creator. He's responsible for our existence. He's responsible for sustaining the world. He's responsible for every breath that we've breathed and you've breathed while you've been watching this YouTube channel so far. And I wonder if you can see right at the beginning that in some ways Christianity and atheism are the very opposite worldviews. They're coming from totally opposite philosophical starting points. According to the Christian, there is a God and he made us and he gave us inquiring minds that we're now using to engage with this question. But according to the atheist, there is no God. We came about by some process that did not require a God in the material world. And I guess if there is a God at all, God is just a figment of a human imagination. So does the world start with God who made us and made our minds, or rather do we have a purposeless universe that came up with a human mind, which has created God? So we're talking about very opposite things. Now, in the time that Paul was first sharing these ideas in Athens in the 1st century, most people believed in some kind of supernatural realm. As I say, the Epicureans were the exception. They thought the world was random. But that probably seemed quite a silly idea to everybody else. Here's a world that looks anything but random. In fact, they were exploring the divine. They were making statues of different deities, because it was just a human instinct that surely all of this couldn't have come about by chance. It just looks too wonderfully designed. There's a passage in the Bible that describes the beautiful clothing of a very, very rich king, a man called Solomon, and says that is nothing compared with the beautiful designs of clothing that God has made for the flowers. Just look at how wonderfully they're designed. Now, that was intuitive to people 2,000 years ago, but then along came Darwin. And the question we're addressing today is, has Darwin made it easier to be an atheist? What seemed ridiculous, because to suggest this was all random, that seems less ridiculous. Now we have Darwin's mechanism. And I'm going to hand over to Richard, because he's got some questions about whether, well, first of all, he's going to explain why natural selection seems to solve the problem. And then he's going to say why it doesn't solve the problem quite as much as we might have thought. So over to you, Richard.
Yeah, so to understand what contribution Darwin may or may not be making to atheism, we have to understand his mechanism to start with. And I'm sure all you Cambridge students know this already, but just in case there's someone watching from Oxford, I'll explain it to you. And I'll do it using some brio. This is my son's train set I've got next to me. And if we walked into the room and we found on the floor this complete circle of brio train set, we would immediately think, well, somebody must have made that train set. If I said to you, no, actually, the box fell over and just randomly that perfect circle got made in the brio, you would think I was probably a bit crazy. As soon as we see a structure that seems to have a purpose, as well as having complexity, we think, well, that must have been something that's the product of a mind. A purposeful, conscious agent must have made that. And that's how things looked back in Paul's time. It's how things look today. But back in Paul's time, the Epicureans were saying, no, actually, it could be due to chance, this kind of purposeful complexity. And they said that must be because there are an infinite number of worlds. The universe is infinitely large and infinitely old. And so there are enough opportunities over that infinite length of time, enough times when, in our analogy, bits of brio are getting jumbled up together, for them occasionally to fall into a complex structure that just looks purposeful. And I guess not many people found that argument very convincing at the time, because Paul goes there assuming that most of them believe in God, even if some of these Epicureans didn't. And generally, most people would agree, well, atheism didn't have a very convincing case back in the 1st century AD. But many people will say, now, since Darwin, we do have a strong case. And so what is that case? Well, it's simply that Darwin's mechanism of random mutation and natural selection, as it's known in the neo-Darwinian synthesis, Darwin's mechanism says, well, we can start with a single piece, and then we can have lots of random perturbations, and perhaps eventually two pieces will get joined together. And let's imagine we have some sort of selective agent that says, I'm looking for longer train tracks and train tracks that make loops. Well, this selective pressure will keep this slightly longer train track in place. And let's imagine there's lots of other random changes going on, lots of random perturbations. Eventually, a third bit might get attached. And then that will be kept and then keep on the process. And eventually you'll get the perfect circle. So what the Darwinian mechanism has done is gradually built up this complex process with lots of small steps, each of which is, maybe improbable, but not as improbable as making the whole thing at once. In fact, the probability of just one of those steps is great enough for us to be able to believe it could actually happen by chance. And so this combination of chance and natural selection mean that the total amount of chance that we need to build up complexity is far less than getting complexity all here at once. And this is something that comes across very strongly and very clearly in the writings, of course, of Richard Dawkins. He explains how Darwin really made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And it's all about the elimination of chance. The less luck you need to make biological complexity, the more credible atheism becomes. That's Richard Dawkins' argument.
And just
and so this is
Richard Dawkins is actually saying that natural selection is an alternative to chance. So rather than saying, oh, this just got lucky, which he thinks would be, a silly argument, he's saying now we got a mechanism which is, I think he described it as the only workable alternative to chance. So you no longer have to believe it's lucky because you got this.
Yeah, and in his book, The God Delusion, he's very clear. It's the opposite of chance. Anyone who says natural selection is a chance process is just mistaken. Yeah.
But your suggestion is that the natural selection doesn't escape chance quite as much as we've been led to believe.
Well, natural selection is that bit of the evolutionary mechanism that isn't due to chance. But I think Dawkins pulls a bit of a fast one on the reader, because sometimes we use the term natural selection to refer to the whole of the evolutionary process, and sometimes we use it just to refer to part of it. So biologists will often say there are 5 components of evolution. There's random mutation, there's natural selection, there's recombination of existing information into different combinations, there's migration, and there's drift. And those are the 5 forces of evolution. And of those 5 forces, natural selection is the one that is definitely not chance. But there are others that do rely a great deal on chance, especially drift. I mean, drift is chance events that happen that are affected by population size. And so you have to ask, what is Dawkins referring to when he's saying this isn't all about chance? And he'll kind of flip-flop between natural selection as just the one of the 5, but he'll also use the term natural selection to refer to the whole thing. And when we're talking about the whole thing, a huge amount of chance is involved in the random mutations that start with. So if we go back to my little Brio analogy, all of the perturbations of the Brio that enable every so often a chance connection to happen, there's a lot of chance involved in those mutations. And the process of drift involves chance as well. And so even within the Darwinian mechanism, chance plays a very important component.
But Dawkins is arguing that you've eliminated chance because you have this criterion of fitness or survival, which selects between them. And you're saying that that hasn't eliminated all the luck that's required.
Luck is very definitely not eliminated from the whole of the Darwinian process. And if you just think about, imagine if in my train set I wanted to have a bridge, a more complex structure. Well, let's imagine that I've got my train set growing, and then in comes this bit here, which is the beginning of a bridge. Well, once that is there, I can't just have any old bit joining my train set. The next bit that has to come along has to be this one. And then once I've got that one, excuse me for a moment as I assemble this, then I have to have a third bit before I can continue. So
Otherwise
essentially I have to have 3 pieces that fall into place in sequence. And that can only really happen by more chance than just a single extra bit making the train track a little bit longer. So I've got a more complex subcomponent of the track that demands more luck in order for it to assemble completely. And when we look at the complexity of life, now we understand so much more about the molecular machines in the cell that are assembled out of vast numbers of different proteins into the most amazing nanotechnology. It's very hard to imagine that those could have assembled without needing huge amounts of luck to get over points where several pieces needed to be added at once. Because you have to remember that you always have to have a functional entity that natural selection is acting on. You can't have natural selection saying, we're just going to wait a bit because this, I promise you this is going to be useful in due course. Just wait until a few more pieces are added. It doesn't work like that. It by definition has no foresight. And so a lot of chance is needed if in any evolutionary pathway to such complex biological structures. And Darwin sort of tends to brush that under the carpet rather. Dawkins tends to brush that under the carpet rather.
And I remember when reading Dawkins, which has been a while ago now, but I remember he always tries to argue that you can get a very complicated thing like an eye through infinitesimally small steps, because he needs that each step needs to be small, and then it's selected for and it's selected for and it's selected for. And something like a bridge is a bit of a nightmare for him. So 2 bits of track is fine, but something that requires 4 bits of track or something is not so good. And you're saying that there just exists within biological systems lots of examples where you seem to need several steps all at once.
Yeah, if you need 2 or 3 or 4 mutations all to happen in synchrony or very quickly after one another, then the probability of that happening, of course, becomes dramatically lower the more of those mutations you need. But I think your first big argument is that we haven't eliminated all the chance we think. We've eliminated part of it, but it's still very lucky. And if it's lucky, that starts to be harder to believe than maybe there's a designer. But that actually, in a way, that's the smaller argument. There's an even bigger problem, right? Because even to get the natural selection mechanism started in the first place, we first have to have the whole molecular machinery, which can contain information and pass information on. We have to have something like DNA or RNA, and the ability for it to replicate itself. And so there's a whole lot of stuff that is required before you can invoke natural selection to help you. You have to have a replicator. Yeah, you have to have a replicating thing. And that's essentially the origin of life. And when Dawkins comes to the origin of life in his book, The God Delusion, he actually invokes huge amounts of luck. He's very clear we need to invoke massive amounts of luck to explain the origin of life. And then he also says the origin of consciousness needs a massive amount of luck. The origin of the eukaryotic cell needs a huge amount of luck. And he says there are probably other steps also that need massive amounts of luck. So he kind of somewhat undermines his own argument there about the elimination of luck.
So basically, where do you get the DNA from? Where do you get the information on the DNA to build the simplest cell that can replicate itself, which is actually a very complex entity, even before you start being able to invoke? So
what I find really interesting at that point, Andrew, is he then says, well, to justify that huge amount of luck, I'm going to invoke the idea that there are huge numbers of planets within the universe which could support life, and that we just happen to be on the lucky planet. And really what he's doing there is falling back on the kind of arguments that these Epicureans made back in the 1st century AD. They were trying to explain everything by just lots and lots of opportunities in an infinite universe. And Dawkins essentially has to fall back on exactly the argument that they had back then.
And people have done something similar, haven't they, with not in the area of biology, but in the area of physics and some of the cosmological fine-tuning, as it's called. So you have to have Planck's constant exactly right, and the speed of light has to be exactly right, and so on, to have this kind of universe at all. And so people have said, well, maybe rather than just having lots of worlds in this universe, maybe there's lots of universes, maybe there's a multiverse. But at which point we're kind of straying outside of science into I guess, conjecture, or even, you might say, if you were to be cheeky, you might say even faith. You know, I don't want to trust that there's a God who did it, so I'll trust that there's a multiverse that did it, even though that's going far beyond any of my data or any ability to test a hypothesis.
Indeed, no observable evidence for the existence of a multiverse. And Dawkins even suggests maybe there are multiple reproducing multiverses, multiple reproducing universes in the multiverse, and some kind of Darwinian process is happening at a universe level. And the mind boggles. I mean, it's a very extravagant hypothesis with absolutely no evidence at all.
The thing that's helped me for this, I think, because often Dawkins will describe it as though Christians are about faith, which he defines as, you know, some kind of leap in the dark in the absence of evidence, whereas science is about facts. Now, of course, science is about facts, but atheism isn't really about facts. It's doing the same sort of, it's making conjectures in the dark. So that the data is telling us this is a very complex universe, and biological beings are extremely complex. And yet then you say, well, what worldview will I plug that into? And the atheist is saying a worldview that's entirely material, which got a bit lucky. And the Christian is saying a worldview where there's a creator who intended it. But at that point, you can't say the atheist is automatically being more scientific than the Christian. We're both coming to the scientific data, but with these very different hypotheses.
And when you say a bit lucky, in the atheist view, I mean, a bit lucky is a massive understatement, isn't it? I mean, the amount of luck is absolutely incredibly large.
Now, okay, so we've made an argument why we think that the idea there's a God who designed it, and so the information that's on the DNA and the extraordinary intricacy of a human being that becomes self-conscious, and etc., is a point. It makes more sense to say there's a God that made us than to say, you know, what a lucky outcome. But doesn't the argument get a bit more difficult for us, Richard? Because Paul, in his speech in Athens, he goes on to say, God made us, he gave us life and breath and everything. And then he says this from the Bible, from one man, he made every nation of human beings to live on the face of the earth. Okay, so we got this idea of an Adam and Eve, and surely that's a impossible thing to believe, isn't it? And I'm saying this to set you up, because I know that you've done some research that you've published in one of the Nature journals about this. Is it implausible to believe that we could have a single human ancestor like the Bible says we do?
Well, no, I don't think it is. And I think it's very interesting that Paul makes this point about us all coming from a single man. I think by that he's meaning a single couple, of course, that we're coming from a single couple, because many of the ancient Greeks believed that each race had arisen spontaneously from the earth of their native land. So the Greeks had spontaneously emerged from the land of the Greece, and the Persians from Persia. And so you can see how this would lead to very territorial ideas and even racism. With each race has an independent origin, whereas Paul is saying no, all human beings have a single pair of ancestors. And so we have the unity of the human race here, which of course is something we all very strongly believe in today. But yeah, people often say, well, that there's so much genetic diversity within modern day human beings. How could we possibly all come from a single couple? And to start off with, it sounds like a very plausible argument. You think, yeah, how could it possibly be that would happen? But if you look very closely at how genetics works and how DNA works, and if you reflect that within a single couple, you have 4 genomes. You have 2 in the man, 2 in the woman. But the DNA code is 4 letters. We often call them A, T, G, and C. So within a single couple, you can actually have every possible single nucleotide variant that there is today, just contained in a single couple. So I don't see a huge problem there. There's much more complexity to this, and as you say, I've written about it in a few blogs. I'll say, just point out, you said in a journal. I haven't actually published a journal article on this. It's just a blog article, so it hasn't been peer reviewed, but it has stood up to a great deal of scrutiny. And And so, yeah, I don't struggle with the idea that we've all come from a single couple from a genetic point of view.
I'll keep going, because this is one of my favorite bits of Paul's speech. He says God made us, he made us from one man, and then he gives us a reason. And I think as a Christian, this is a wonderful thing. He says he made us in order that we should seek God and perhaps feel our way towards him and find him. And that means that according to the Christian worldview, it's not an accident that humans are relational, or indeed it's not an accident that we're capable of a relationship with the God who made us. I remember that blew my mind, because when I was first looking into Christianity, I guess I was looking maybe for a God who was an equation, or a God who was a particle. I think it's just particle physicists trying to make their work sound sexier by calling a boson a God particle. But maybe we just need God to fill in some kind of missing equation or some missing cause. But it never occurred to me that God could be personal, and that it wasn't an accident that we were personal, and that he intended relationship with us. And one of the big problems for Darwinism is why and how does self-awareness and consciousness emerge by accident? I mean, why is that an advantage in propagating your genome, and how do you get there? Whereas to say in the Christian understanding, it's actually part of the intention of why we're the way we are, that we're capable of relationship. And I think it ends up grounding things like the personal and the moral. So I'm personal because I was made by a personal God. I'm moral because I was made by a moral God. Whereas if we just sort of attach these as descriptions of what really started as random numbers, here's a chance outcome, but I'll call it personal, or here's a chance outcome and I'll call it good. These categories of personal and impersonal, good and evil, they kind of collapse. In fact, Dawkins even admits that. He says, in that famous quote, in a world of blind physical forces and genetic replication, at bottom there'll be no good and no evil. These are just arbitrary labels. So it is possible to know God and have a relationship with him, says Paul. Now, we'll get back to the science in a minute, and people can ask about science as questions, but people might be interested, Richard, to know what that actually means to you. So they know that you have Christian convictions, you have Christian beliefs, but what does it mean for you to have a Christian relationship? It's not just that you believe in God as an equation, but you think you know him as a father. And I've spoken to you about this before, and if I may, it's slightly personal, but I know you've got 2 children, and when James was born, it was a very frightening time. And maybe you could just use it as an example of telling us what difference it made to believe in God.
Yeah, so when my first child was born, he, we didn't know to start with, but what had actually happened was he'd had a stroke around the time of his birth. And he was in intensive care for quite a few days. And when he first went in, it could have been a whole number of things, of which a stroke was the the least worst possibility. And to be perfectly honest, to start with, it was incredibly difficult. And I looked at the other parents in the NICU, and I just thought they were all just handling their situation so much better than I was. Of course, it was partly because many of them, their children had been in there for many days already, and so it wasn't such a new thing for them. But I think for me as a Christian, there was this extra hurdle. Well, what's God doing here? Why is this happening to me? What does it mean for my relationship with God? And so to start with, it added a sort of extra level of difficulty. But then in the longer run, I mean, it really forced me to be praying, and praying that my son would live, and that everything would be okay, and that if he didn't live, that if he died, that he would go to be with God. And in the end, it really deepened my relationship with God and my faith in God. And now James is 3 and he's running around, and you could hardly tell that he'd ever had a stroke. And it's just amazing. We have friends who their child has had a stroke, and you really can still see it. But thankfully with James, we've come through the other side, but learned a lot of lessons on the way, which I'm very thankful for. And what I think this brings us to is, fundamentally, is did mind come first and then matter? Or did matter come first and then mind? And it seems to me that the mind first view is a more plausible view of the universe that takes into account the entirety of our existence and the way human beings interact. And I remember a few years ago, Andrew, we went to a play, didn't we, by Tom Stoppard called The Hard Problem.
Yeah.
And it was a really interesting discussion of this very issue, the problem of human consciousness. And it's very powerful how he pitches a student who's beginning to think that actually there's more to life than just matter, against a biology professor who's very skeptical. And Tom Stoppard really kind of wins you round to the view that actually there's more to life than just matter. And it's very hard to explain how human consciousness could happen in a material universe and how it could evolve. You know, why would we evolve this level of consciousness that we have that we can't fully explain through physical processes? Why does it really help us so much to survive and reproduce that we would have such sophisticated minds?
And we've got just one little paragraph left of Paul's speech. So he says God made the world. He gave us life and breath and everything. He made us all from one ancestor. He made us in order that we might know him relationally. And then he finishes like this. Being God's offspring, we shouldn't think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. It wasn't that we created God somehow, in the way that I guess ancient religions did with their different idols and ideas. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, which just means to change their minds. So the God who made us commands us to change our minds. And maybe this is a challenge for you as you're watching this. God wants you to change your mind. And then he gives a reason. And this always surprised me because, again, another thing that Richard Dawkins says about Christians is that you're just asked to believe things by a leap in the dark. And since I've been a Christian for over 20 years now, I think I can't think of anything that the Bible ever asks you to believe without giving you a reason. And in this case, here's the reason. He wants us to change our mind because he's fixed a day on which he'll judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he's appointed. And of this, he's given proof to all by raising him from the dead. So Paul is saying, I'm not just asking you to believe my view because I'm a persuasive speaker. I'm asking you to believe my view because the God who made us sent his son into the world. He died, and then physically he was resurrected from the dead. And on the basis of that, we ought to change our minds. And I think that stands to reason. I mean, as I think every one of us would be convinced we need to change our minds if we witnessed it. And the claim is that the early Christians did witness it. If you'd been to someone's execution and you'd seen them die and you were sure they were dead, and then 3 days later you met them again, that would cause you to rethink quite a lot of what you believed about the universe, I think. I mean, that's convincing to me. I've been to some funerals and I've seen some dead bodies and I've never met those people again. And if I had met them again, and the Christian claim is, and the first followers of Jesus, those who risked their life for testifying to this claim, they were there, they were eyewitnesses, they were convinced. But what I want to talk about today with you, Richard, is the fact that when it comes to resurrection, someone like Richard Dawkins, he doesn't even really engage with it. So we're not interested in, could this have happened? What was the evidence? What was the motive of people saying that they'd seen it if they'd made it up? And he doesn't bother with any of that. He just says it can't have happened, being a contradiction of the laws of nature or the laws of physics. And it seems to me at that point, he's kind of betrayed his whole methodology, because that isn't the methodology I think of a scientist, where you say, I've got a hypothesis, but if I come across different data, I'll revise my hypothesis. So my hypothesis is somebody dies and that's it. But, oh, here's an exception. Somebody died and then they came back. What's going on? And I might need to revise my theory. But Richard Dawkins, he's kind of got his presuppositions first, and he won't question them. So if you start by saying, I know there is no God, I know the universe is material, I know there are no transcendent causes beyond the material universe, then it's pretty difficult to think of any kind of mechanism for a resurrection within that system. So because the theory won't allow it, he doesn't allow it. But what an empirical scientist ought to do is say, well, if I get a data point that doesn't fit my theory, maybe I'll revise my theory. So, you know, a world without a God, a world that was purely material with invariant physical laws, couldn't have a resurrection. But here's a resurrection. Therefore, let me revise my theory. Maybe this isn't a world without a God. This isn't a world with only material causes. Maybe there is a God of such power that he created life in the first place, and that he could even give new life to a dead corpse, bring him back from the dead. So I think if we're objective and open-minded about the data, it actually points us away. I mean, atheism can't fit the hypothesis can't fit the data, whereas the idea that we have a creator and life giver really can. And I don't know, Richard, how you've encountered this, but I often have discussions where the miracle is the big problem for the atheist. They go, I can't believe in these miracles because they wouldn't be allowed. And I think what they're trying to say is these miracles couldn't fit within my current presuppositions. And I want to say, that's right. You need to change your presuppositions. You need to believe in a different kind of reality. Have you found miracles a sticking point yourself, or with friends that you've spoken to?
Well, I think it's very interesting, isn't it, that Paul ends up with this, and he's using the resurrection as evidence. He's saying, look, you should believe what I'm saying because God has raised someone from the dead. And of course, today that just feels like him putting a stumbling block in the way. You think that's not evidence to persuade me to believe what you're saying. That's just evidence that you're a nutcase and that I shouldn't believe you at all. And evidently some of the people in Athens thought the same thing when he said that. Some of them were completely put off. And it's the same in the life of Jesus. You know, Jesus is going around doing miracles and people are believing on him because of the miracles. But today we look back and, you know, even many vicars of the Church of England like you, Andrew, would disagree with you and say, well, actually, I don't believe these miracles at all. And I think you're right that it strikes us as going very much against science. But as you say, how do we define science? That's the crucial thing. Do we define science as a set of philosophical presuppositions that say only natural causes ever happen and only natural things can happen? Or do we define science as following the evidence wherever it leads, what you called a more empirical approach? And I think for these people at the time, like Paul, they were so persuaded that they had seen the risen Jesus that they thought it was just being empirical to say, okay, he must have risen from the dead. I wasn't expecting that. I didn't think it would happen, but I saw it. Therefore, it's had this powerful effect on me and it's changed my life.
And the fact they weren't expecting it actually really helps, doesn't it? Because I think sometimes we have this idea that first century people were so credulous and unscientific that they didn't realize that resurrections weren't supposed to be allowed. You know, but actually, as you say, nothing could be further from their expectation. And that goes for all of Jesus' miracles. I mean, when Jesus walks on water, I mean, these are fishermen, and you don't have to do much fishing before you realize that you can't walk out on water. You know, you get out the boat, you always go up to your neck. And so they respond in exactly the way that intelligent people who understand how the world works would react. They are astonished, they're frightened. They ask, who is this? We've never seen anything like this.
So I guess the key thing here, Andrew, is are these people reliable sources? You know, are they really eyewitnesses whose minds were blown by seeing these events, or are these just made up stories? And you know, for you as a vicar, what persuades you that these sources really are reliable? That someone like Matthew, someone like Paul, really did see these, frankly, supernatural things happen?
That's a good question, and I think we're almost out of time before we give people time for questions. But I mean, all sorts of things. I think firstly, the idea that like, why do they make it up? I mean, these people didn't get, I know, look, nowadays the church is very rich and there's lots of corruption, but people weren't rich for being Christians in the first century. You were persecuted and marginalized and poor. As they were being persecuted, why did they all stick to the same story? If they made it up, why didn't they make up something popular? You know, a Jesus who would be a revolutionary against the Roman oppressor. But instead they give us a Jesus who tells you to be a good citizen, turn the other cheek and pay your taxes. This wasn't the kind of Messiah people were looking for. Why make the first witnesses of the resurrection women in a culture which was quite sexist, where a woman's testimony wasn't considered reliable? You know, if you're trying to make it up, you could do better. You know, there's this kind of honesty to it. It's a kind of warts and all picture. And yeah, there's more we could say. We promised we would talk for 40 minutes and we have. So I think now, in Athens, as you alluded to, when people heard of the resurrection of the dead, we read, some mocked, others said, we want to hear more about this. And I guess maybe the same reactions are happening on YouTube right now. So let's find out.
Yes, thank you so much, Richard and Andrew. Thank you. That's really, really interesting. Thank you everyone who's watching for all of your questions as well. It's been really exciting going through them. We've tried to group together some of the questions, and thank you, Richard and Andrew, for being open to that. So I guess the first things might be some small clarification points. So Richard, could you give some examples of biological bridges?
Oh, I see. As in a sort of complex structure that is very hard to imagine that a step by single step gradualistic pathway could actually have brought it about. Well, one example that immediately springs to mind is something called ATP synthase, and we have trillions of this molecular machine within our bodies and in every living thing. And it's a tiny turbine, and it's situated in a membrane, and it's powered by a flow of ions, and it rotates. And as it rotates, it causes ADP to be turned into ATP, which is how energy is transported around the cells. And this is a mechanism that we've only understood for less than 20 years. And it's mind-bogglingly complicated. It's a piece of nanotechnology that we would be utterly unable to make ourselves. And nobody has come up, needless to say, with a step-by-step pathway by which it could have evolved, with every step of the pathway being functional. Now, you might say, well, this is a very complex thing. It will take many years to come up with such a pathway. But I think that's sort of a statement of faith, really, to say, well, one day science will show us a pathway for how this came about. You know, it depends how strong your faith is. If you've got really strong faith, then well, maybe you'll be satisfied with that. But to me, as I look at that, I think very hard to see that even in 100 years' time, this problem will be solved from a purely Darwinian perspective.
Yeah, thank you.
Because you'd have to, just to be clear, you'd have to find an advantage to a little ramp that wasn't the same as the advantage for the bridge. So you'd have to find a sort of independent reason why each bit of it was useful. Whereas actually, if you just have a ramp, the train derails and it doesn't really help you.
Cool, thank you. So we have another question here, which is, why does the argument of luck or evolution being unlikely actually change anything? And could it not still have happened?
Well, I think the argument...
Did you want to speak?
Sure, okay. I think the argument is that before Darwin, atheism wasn't really intellectually fulfilling, but after Darwin it is. And the reason being that Darwin eliminates a lot of luck. But then when we start to look closely at what someone like Richard Dawkins has to believe, there's actually a huge amount of luck there. And bear in mind also that these ancient Epicureans, they thought the universe was infinitely large and infinitely old. So they had probabilistic resources that we don't have. We all today agree that the universe had a beginning, and that it's not infinite in its extent. And so the probabilistic resources are more limited. So it seems to me this problem of luck is still there for an atheist just as much as it was before Darwin. And so the idea that Darwin made it credible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, I think, is undermined by that.
Just to approach the same thing from a different angle, James was actually talking to me about this the other day, and that sometimes people call it the strong anthropic principle, the idea of, okay, it was very, 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 very unlikely that I'm here, but I am here. And the only kind of universe where I could wonder why I'm here is the one where I got lucky. So what's the point of of being surprised? And I find that an implausible argument. And I quite like the analogy that Professor John Lennox uses. And he says it's a bit like if you were sentenced to death by firing squad, and you're standing there against the wall, and there's 20, crack troops, all with their rifles trained on you, and the sergeant major says, "Ready, aim, fire," and they all miss. And according to the anthropic principle, you shouldn't really ask why, because you go, well, the only kind of universe where I'm here to wonder why I'm alive is the one where they miss. So they did miss. And yet it just strikes you as it's intuitively extremely unlikely scenario. And it just involves, I think, the abandonment of curiosity to say, I won't ask, I think to say that isn't a problem that needs explaining, it was just lucky, is to abandon intellectual curiosity at all. But I guess you might say, if you were really, really anxious not to invoke the idea there could be a God that made us, which seems a much more parsimonious explanation.
Mm-hmm. So it's almost dodging the question.
Yeah, I think it's dodging the question, and it's like saying I'm not curious about why I'm here. It was just a random number, and I'll leave it at that. And of course, that has all kinds of implications for human life and value. I mean, if I'm here by accident, then my life doesn't really matter. It's not really for anything. It doesn't really have any purpose to it. And again, you might say, well, that's the grim truth, but isn't it at least worth investigating in case that isn't the grim truth? What if there were a God who'd made me for a reason and my life had a purpose and an intention? But just to say, I think sometimes, and this was true for me anyway, I was very reluctant to believe. So I met Christians at Cambridge. I discovered they weren't as stupid as I expected them to be. I know that sounds arrogant, but I really did think that Christians were all sort of credulous fools until I met some who were quite intelligent. They weren't stupid. And I started to realize there were actually reasons for believing this, and it was coherent philosophically, and there was historical evidence for Jesus and so on. But then I found myself not really wanting to believe it, because I just had this suspicion, look, if this is true, it's going to wreck my life, because at the moment I'm free, I can do what I want. And if there's a God that I'm supposed to answer to and I have to live his way, that would be such a drag. And, and I genuinely feared Christianity being true, because I thought it would wreck things. And so I was kind of looking for a refuge. And I can be cheeky enough, I wonder whether some other viewers of this channel are in the same position. As in, it's not, atheism's attractive to you, not because it's more coherent, but just because it lets you off having to think about difficult things. I remember, thinking in my first year, if I've been living in a world where every single breath I breathe is a gift from God, and I've not given him the time of day, I'm not in a good place. That's very offensive. And I kind of didn't want to go there. And maybe for some of us, Darwinism is the opt-out that means I don't have to face those questions. But I would say to you as a Christian, it hasn't been a drag, and knowing a God that made you and wants to know you is a wonderful thing. So, I was wrong about my fears, but maybe that's partly what's going on.
Yeah. And I guess we've looked at why not atheism, but surely the other option is theism. Why would you say the Christian God over so many other religions?
First thing to say is the religions of the world, I think, are mutually exclusive. So they just make contradictory and incompatible claims. I'll just give you a very simple one. According to the Quran, Jesus is not God, he's a prophet, and he did not die on a cross. So Muslims believe that there was a case of mistaken identity where Judas Iscariot got killed instead. Because God wouldn't have allowed a prophet to be killed in such a horrible way as by crucifixion. So the Quran is explicit. Jesus is not God and didn't get crucified. And the Bible says that the death of Jesus on the cross is absolutely the heart of Christianity, because it's the way that Jesus came on a rescue mission to pay for our wrongs so that we could be forgiven and redeemed. So, you know, either Jesus died on the cross or didn't die on the cross, but not both. I mean, these are historically incompatible. So, you know, you can therefore go around them one by one, and I'd rather you did that than not be curious. By all means, look into Islam. By all means, look into Hinduism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, whatever you can find. But in a way, I would say eventually get around to Christianity, and it might be quite an efficient place to start, because unlike some of the other religions of the world, which are kind of philosophical systems without much of a way of checking, you know, if you found out that the Buddha didn't exist, that's not really a big deal, because you still got the ideas of Buddhism. If some of the Hindu gurus didn't exist, that's okay, because you've got the ideas of the Hindu gurus. But if Jesus didn't exist, Christianity is, you know, you can cross that off your list. It's fake. So because it's historically grounded, and it's it's checkable, I would say it's quite efficient to start there. And so I started there, and it wasn't as dismissible as I thought. And I began to realize this is quite compelling. There's actually reasons to believe this. So, you know, you might want to get hold of one of the first century biographers of Jesus and find out what he's supposed to have done and said by people who were there. You know, by all means, read it critically, read it cynically, ask skeptical questions, but read it, engage with it. That's something I'd never done until I was in my first year, and it changed my life. So, you know, give it a try. But yeah, I'm not telling you don't look into Islam, don't look into Hinduism. They can't all be true. Maybe one of them's true. I suggest you Jesus is a good place to start.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then going back to DNA and genetics, so we have some questions on that. So how do you explain the similarities between primates and humans, and the fact that Europeans have been shown to have Neanderthal DNA as well?
Well, those similarities are certainly there, and I totally have no problem thinking that we have some Neanderthal DNA within many of us. I think the really critical issue is this issue of consciousness. You know, the issue of human consciousness versus the consciousness of all other living organisms. And I think that is where the real discontinuity is. You know, why is it that we have such a strong sense of right and wrong? Our abilities at language transcend so much of what's in the among other animals, and I think that demands an explanation which Darwinism can't give us. And so I think that's where the really important discontinuity is. And this is an argument that's been made by the philosopher Richard Swinburne, and also the philosopher, well, to a lesser extent, Thomas Nagel, who's, interestingly, Thomas Nagel is an atheist, but in his book Mind and Cosmos, he argues that consciousness is something which we just can't explain by material processes. It demands another explanation. And for him, it seems to be sort of particles of consciousness around in the universe. But I think this issue of human beings as organisms that have the potential for relationship with God, who is mind, and we have a mind ourselves, which we struggle to explain by any physical process, that's a really important area for me.
Just to be clear, Richard, you're not saying, you know, you reject natural selection as a mechanism, or you reject evolution as a process, because I mean, this is what you do all day, right? This is your research area. Right, yeah. The question is that by itself sufficient without anything else to explain all biological life? So, you know, yeah, that's the difference.
Yeah.
And I guess on that, could you maybe talk a little bit more about, can Christians believe God created humans through evolution? Can Christians believe in evolution? Obviously, you are an evolutionary biologist, so what is the logic there?
I think they can, but as I say, I think this issue of the human soul is a really crucial one. I think there has to be some kind of divine intervention for the first human, or the first humans. That seems to me to be essential, really, for Christian belief. But how the physical body got there, I think is a less important issue, and Christians differ greatly in their views about that issue. I don't know where you come down on that one, Andrew.
Yeah, I think the non. I mean, you referred to provocatively to vicars who don't believe in the resurrection, and there are some, but I think at that point they're being totally untrue to Jesus and his teachings and the claims of early Christians. So I think you can find people who say they're Christian who believe all sorts of things, but I'd have thought the non-negotiables are that God is our creator and that we owe our existence to him, that God makes human beings through a particular act of creation in order that we might know him and relationally. And I think those are non-negotiable things, which I think if you don't believe those, then you're out of step with Jesus' teaching in a very serious way. But as you say, within that, there's all sorts of varieties of views amongst Christians.
And the big thing is that we're here for a purpose, and someone had us in mind. We're not the result of a purposeless natural process that did not have us in mind. We're here for a reason. Life has meaning. Human life has meaning. That's the big area where I would differ from someone like Richard Dawkins.
Okay, so last question before we probably have to wrap up. So if someone said, if I came to believe God made the world and us, what does that mean for me? So I guess what is the implication for this on our lives?
I mean, you could believe that just as a change of sort of philosophical commitment, and that wouldn't make much difference, I guess. You could say, I used to think that the world came about by chance and natural selection. Now I also am adding in God as a first cause, which solves some problems like why did the Big Bang go bang and where did the DNA come from? And that's fine. But that isn't the response that Paul is looking for, or it's not the response that God is looking for. So the God who made us wants to know us. He wants to be in relationship with us. That's what life's about. And he is urgently calling us to change our minds, even to the extent that God would come to earth as a human being and be crucified and rise again in front of eyewitnesses, so that we get real evidence on which to change our mind. And God is looking for you to reach out to him and find him. And the way that we can do that, the way that we can know God is, I mean, imagine, if I decided to get to know the Queen personally, I have very little chance of being able to do that. I could go to Buckingham Palace and pretty soon I get arrested by MI5 or whatever and questioned. But it's even harder to say, I'm going to get to know God who made me, who's not material, who I can't find the phone number for, who I can't isolate from my apparatus to take a null reading as a control. I mean, it's beyond the possibilities of my own inquiry to do that. But the wonderful thing about God is he not only wants to know us, but he's taken the initiative to make that possible. And he sent his son to earth, and Jesus lived and died and rose again. And if he rose again, that means he's still alive now, and we can know him. And I'd say the place to start is to look at Jesus, get hold of one of the biographies of Jesus from the New Testament and read it. Read it critically. No one's asking you to throw your brain away, contrary to what Dawkins suggests. Read it critically, but see what you find. Something I often say to friends, and I can make this offer, I guess, on behalf of the KitQ, but I often say to people, get one of the biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You could read the whole thing probably in 2 hours, 3 hours. But instead of doing that, why not read the first chapter in 1 hour? So read it slowly enough to actually think about what it says and mull over it. And I suggest to people, you get a printed copy of it. Why not annotate it? So tick everything you like, but across against everything you find objectionable, and underline anything you don't understand. And then ask your Christian friend for a coffee and go through your annotations And obviously at the moment that's not allowed. So ask your Christian friend for exercise, because that's the only way we're allowed to meet somebody, or a Zoom call. But eventually we'll be able to meet for coffee. And if that's useful, then do the same for chapter 2. And if that's useful, do the same for chapter 3. And if it stops being useful, stop. But all you've got to lose is an hour of your life from one chapter, but potentially could change your life. So do something to be curious about it. Don't just abandon the question, I say.
Thank you so much. And I think that brings us to the close of our live stream tonight. However, it doesn't need to be the end of the discussion. So I'm conscious there were loads more questions that we didn't get to answer. And we'd love to help you guys watching to continue the conversation. So with that in mind, there is a few more things to consider.
So firstly, we'll be holding a discussion Zoom call at around about 20 to 9 after this live stream, where you can talk to other people about the conversation today. The link for that will be posted in the YouTube live chat, and we'd love you to join and discuss your thoughts.
And next, you can sign up to receive a Christian book completely free on us. So why not sign up for that and read the book with a friend? And all the details for that are on the Google form in the YouTube description.
This is also not the only event that KICU is hosting this term. We've got a whole host of events as part of a 2-week series called Story. Story is where we'll be hearing from people ranging from criminals to genocide survivors, and they'll be discussing the impact that Jesus has had on their lives. All of the information for that can be found at storycambridge.uk, and the link will be posted in the YouTube live chat.
And we'd just like to thank everyone involved for making this event happen. So in particular, Andrew and Richard, for giving up your time in your schedules to be online with us. And thanks most of all to everyone tuning in. We really hope this has been an interesting event for everyone and that this is only the beginning of the discussion. So we look forward to seeing you in the future, perhaps on the Zoom call or at the Story events happening soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.